The sound of my stepdad Rick's voice still echoes in my head sometimes, especially that smug tone he used when he told me what he'd done. "Oh, that old guitar? Yeah, I sold it at the yard sale this morning. Got $50 for it. $50. For my father's 1963 Martin D. 28 acoustic guitar that he'd saved up for 3 years to buy when he was just 22 years old. The same guitar he taught me to play Wonderful Tonight on when I was 12, his calloused fingers guiding mine across the frets while my mom watched from the kitchen doorway with tears in her eyes. Rick knew exactly what that guitar meant to me, and he sold it anyway, like it was just another piece of junk cluttering up his precious garage. That's when I realized that sometimes, when someone pushes you past your breaking point, you don't just push back, you bulldoze right through them. I should probably start from the beginning, because this story isn't really about a guitar or even about revenge. It's about what happens when you spend years letting someone slowly chip away at everything you hold sacred until there's nothing left but white-hot rage and the sudden, crystal-clear understanding that you've had enough. My name is Sarah, I'm 28 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've been living in what I thought was a blended family with my mom Linda, my stepdad Rick, and his 2 spoiled kids from his first marriage. I moved back home after college to help mom with the bills and to stay close to the memories of dad, who passed away from a heart attack when I was 16. The house still smelled like his Old Spice cologne sometimes, especially in his old workshop where he kept his tools and, until last Tuesday morning, his beloved guitar. Rick moved in about a year after Dad died, sweeping Mom off her feet with his charm and his promises to take care of everything. At first, I was actually grateful. Mom had been so lost without Dad, and Rick seemed to bring back her smile. He was a car salesman at the Ford dealership downtown, always dressed in pressed khakis and polo shirts, always ready with a joke or a compliment. But car salesmen are professional liars, and it didn't take long for his true colors to show once he got comfortable. He started small, making little comments about how I should contribute more to the household or how my dad wasn't much of a provider since Mom struggled financially after he died. When I'd try to defend Dad's memory, Rick would hold up his hands and say, "Hey, I'm not trying to replace him, kiddo. Just saying it like it is." The way he said kiddo always made my skin crawl, like he was talking to a child instead of a grown woman with a college degree and a full-time job at the local bank. The real problem started when Rick decided that Dad's things were taking up too much space in the house that Mom had lived in for 20 years. First, it was Dad's recliner. "We don't need 2 chairs in the living room," Rick declared, and somehow convinced Mom to let him donate it to Goodwill. Then it was Dad's books, his tools, his collection of baseball cards from the 1980s that he'd treasured since he was a kid. One by one, pieces of my father disappeared from our home, replaced by Rick's ugly brown leather furniture and his collection of fishing magazines. Every time I protested, Rick would get that patronizing look on his face and explain to me like I was 5 years old that it's time to move forward and holding onto the past isn't healthy. Mom would nod along, caught between wanting to keep the peace and honoring Dad's memory, and somehow Rick always won those battles. I started to realize that he wasn't just moving into our house, he was systematically erasing my father from it. But Dad's guitar was supposed to be off limits. When Rick first brought up organizing the garage 6 months ago, I made it crystal clear that the guitar was mine and that it was never, ever to be touched. "That guitar is all I have left of him," I told Rick, my voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. I explained how Dad had saved every penny from his job at the factory to buy that Martin, how he'd played it every evening after dinner, how he'd promised it would be mine someday. Rick nodded and said he understood, even put his hand on my shoulder in what I thought was a gesture of support. "Of course, Sarah. That's yours. I wouldn't dream of touching it." I should have known better than to trust a man who could lie about the mileage on a used car without blinking, but I wanted so desperately to believe that he had some shred of decency left in him. I thought that surely, even Rick wouldn't be cruel enough to touch the one thing that connected me to my father's memory. Last Tuesday started like any other day. I left for work at the bank at 7:30 in the morning, kissing Mom goodbye and reminding her that I'd be home late because of our monthly staff meeting. Rick was already out in the garage, supposedly organizing for the yard sale he'd been planning for weeks. I remember feeling a little uneasy about leaving him alone with Dad's things, but I pushed the feeling down. After all, he'd promised he wouldn't touch the guitar, and even Rick wouldn't break a promise that important. I spent the day helping customers with their loans and deposits, completely unaware that while I was explaining interest rates and payment schedules, Rick was systematically destroying what was left of my relationship with my father's memory. When I finally pulled into our driveway at 6:15 that evening, tired from a long day and looking forward to maybe playing Dad's guitar for a few minutes before dinner, I had no idea that my entire world was about to come crashing down around me. The garage door was still open when I got home, and I could see Rick inside, counting a stack of crumpled bills with that satisfied smirk he always wore when he thought he'd gotten away with something. The folding tables that had been set up for the yard sale were mostly empty now, just a few random items scattered across them, old kitchen appliances, some of Mom's books she'd apparently agreed to part with, and a cardboard box full of Dad's tools that made my stomach clench. But it was the empty space in the corner, where Dad's guitar had stood in its case for the past 12 years, that made my blood run cold. The corner where I'd seen it just that morning, where it had been waiting for me like it always did, was completely bare except for a dusty outline on the concrete floor. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing, before I finally found my voice. "Rick," I called out, my voice strangely calm despite the panic rising in my chest. "Where's Dad's guitar?" That's when he said it, those words that I'll never forget as long as I live. "Oh, that old guitar?" "Yeah, I sold it at the yard sale this morning. Got $50 for it." He didn't even look up from counting his money, didn't even have the decency to meet my eyes when he delivered the news that felt like a physical blow to my chest. When I asked him how he could do that, how he could sell something that wasn't his to sell, he finally looked up with that familiar expression of mock innocence that I'd grown to hate. "Come on, Sarah, it was just sitting there collecting dust. You never even played it anymore." That was a lie, and he knew it. I played that guitar every week, sometimes more, usually late at night when the house was quiet and I could pretend Dad was still there listening. Rick had heard me playing it plenty of times, had even complained about the noise on more than one occasion. But now he was acting like it was some forgotten relic that nobody cared about, like my father's most precious possession was just another piece of garage sale junk. I tried to stay calm, tried to reason with him, even though my hands were shaking and I could feel tears burning behind my eyes. "Rick, you promised me you wouldn't touch that guitar. You looked me in the eye and promised." But he just shrugged, that infuriating casual shrug that suggested my pain was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to him. "Things change, kiddo. Besides, $50 is $50. That's money we can actually use instead of just sitting there looking at some old guitar." The way he said old guitar like it was worthless, like the 3 years of my father's life that went into saving for it meant nothing, made something inside me snap. I demanded to know who bought it, thinking maybe I could track them down and buy it back, but Rick claimed he couldn't remember. Some guy, I think. Or maybe it was a woman. "I don't know, Sarah. I sold a lot of stuff today." He was lying. I could tell by the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, but there was nothing I could do about it. The guitar was gone, and Rick was acting like I was being unreasonable for being upset about it. That night, I called my best friend Jessica, sobbing into the phone as I told her what had happened. She was furious, more furious than I'd ever heard her, and suggested I call the police. "That's theft, Sarah. she said. He stole your guitar and sold it. That's literally a crime. But when I tried to explain the situation to the police dispatcher, I realized how complicated it would sound. The guitar had been in Rick's garage, in the house where he lived with my mother, and I didn't have any paperwork proving it was mine. Dad had bought it with cash back in 1985, long before he met my mom, and there was no receipt, no insurance papers, nothing that would hold up in court. The dispatcher was polite, but made it clear that this sounded like a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. I hung up feeling more helpless than ever, and that's when Jessica said something that changed everything. You know what, Sarah? Sometimes you have to make your own justice. What's the most valuable thing Rick owns? I knew the answer immediately. His 2019 Ford Mustang GT that he'd bought brand new and babied like it was his firstborn child. Rick's relationship with that car was honestly disturbing. He washed it every Saturday morning, rain or shine, spending hours with special soap and microfiber cloths, polishing every inch until it gleamed. He'd installed a custom alarm system and refused to park it anywhere but in the garage, which meant Mom had to park her 10-year-old Honda in the driveway even in the worst weather. He'd named the car Shelby after some racing driver and would actually talk to it like it was a person, patting the hood and saying things like, "That's my girl," when he got a good parking spot. The car was his pride and joy, his proof that he'd made it in life, and he never let anyone forget how much it cost him. $32,000, he'd brag to anyone who'd listen. Fully loaded, leather interior, premium sound system. Not bad for a guy who started out selling used cars, right? He'd even forbidden me from borrowing it when my car was in the shop last year, claiming that I wouldn't know how to handle that much power. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rick thought I couldn't handle his precious car, but apparently I couldn't handle keeping my father's guitar safe either. Over the next few days, I watched Rick carefully, studying his routines and his habits like I was planning a heist. Every morning, he'd leave for work at exactly 8:15, kissing Mom goodbye and promising to be home by 6 for dinner. He always took his lunch break at the same diner downtown, always came home for exactly 1 hour, and always parked the Mustang in the same spot in the garage. On Friday afternoons, he'd drive to his buddy Dave's house to watch football and drink beer, staying until late in the evening. Rick was a creature of habit, predictable as clockwork, and that predictability was going to be his downfall. I started researching car values online, looking up what a 2019 Mustang GT with low mileage would be worth, and I couldn't help but smile when I saw the numbers. Even used, Rick's beloved car was worth at least $28,000, probably more. But I wasn't planning to sell it for fair market value. I was going to sell it for exactly what Rick had sold my father's guitar for, $50. The plan started to form in my mind like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. I knew where Rick kept his spare keys, in a little magnetic box under the workbench in the garage, the same place Dad used to keep his spare keys. I knew Rick's schedule better than he did, knew exactly when he'd be out of the house and for how long. Most importantly, I knew how to drive a manual transmission, something Rick had never bothered to teach his own kids, because he was too protective of his precious car. Dad had taught me on his old pickup truck when I was 17, making me practice for hours in empty parking lots until I could handle the clutch and gears like a pro. "You never know when you might need the skill, sweetheart," he'd said, and now I understood exactly what he meant. Rick had taken something irreplaceable from me without permission, and I was going to do the same thing to him. The only difference was that he'd be getting his car back eventually. I'd never see Dad's guitar again. The opportunity came on a Thursday afternoon when Rick announced he was driving to Springfield to pick up some paperwork from the regional Ford office. "I'll be gone most of the day," he told Mom over breakfast, kissing her cheek and grabbing his coffee mug. "Don't wait up for dinner. I'll probably grab something on the road." Mom nodded and went back to reading her newspaper, completely unaware that she'd just given me the perfect window to execute my plan. I called in sick to work that morning, something I'd never done for anything other than actual illness, but this felt like the most important thing I'd ever have to do. As soon as Rick's Mustang disappeared down our street, I put on my darkest sunglasses and a baseball cap I'd borrowed from Mom's closet, grabbed the spare keys from their hiding spot, and opened the garage door. The Mustang sat there gleaming under the fluorescent lights, all $32,000 of Rick's pride and joy, completely defenseless and about to become the instrument of my revenge. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the mirrors and familiarized myself with the car's controls. The leather seats still had that new car smell even after 5 years, and the dashboard looked like something out of a spaceship with all its digital displays and buttons. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. This was Rick's baby, his most prized possession, and I was about to betray his trust just like he'd betrayed mine. But then I remembered the empty corner in the garage where Dad's guitar used to stand. Remembered Rick's smug face when he told me he'd sold it, remembered how he'd promised to leave it alone, and then broken that promise without a second thought. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a sound that would have made Rick weep with joy under different circumstances. Instead, it was the sound of justice finally coming for him, even if he didn't know it yet. I drove straight to the roughest part of town, to a neighborhood where Rick would never voluntarily set foot. There was a corner where day laborers gathered every morning looking for work, where people sold everything from electronics to furniture out of the backs of pickup trucks, where $50 could buy you anything from a bicycle to a microwave if you knew who to ask. I parked the Mustang right in the middle of it all, put a handwritten "for sale" $50 sign on the windshield, and waited. Within 10 minutes, I had a crowd of people around the car, all of them certain it was some kind of joke or scam. "Lady, this car's gotta be worth 30 grand, one man said, running his hand along the hood with obvious appreciation. "You sure you mean $50, not 50,000? I assured him I meant exactly what the sign said, and when he asked why I was selling it so cheap, I told him the truth. Someone sold something of mine for $50 without permission, so now I'm returning the favor. The buyer was a young guy named Miguel who worked construction and had been saving up for months to buy his girlfriend a decent car for her nursing school commute. He kept asking if I was sure, if there was something wrong with the car, if this was legal, and I assured him that everything was fine. The title's at home, I told him, which was technically true. Rick kept all his important papers in a filing cabinet in his bedroom. I'll have to bring it by later, but the car is yours if you want it. Miguel handed me 2 $20 bills and a 10, counting out the money carefully like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. As I watched him drive away in Rick's beloved Mustang, his girlfriend squealing with excitement in the passenger seat, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Rick had sold my father's irreplaceable guitar to some stranger for $50, and now his precious car was driving off into the sunset for the exact same amount. The hard part was waiting. I went home, put the spare keys back in their hiding spot, and tried to act normal while my heart pounded with adrenaline and terror. Mom asked why I'd come home early from work, and I told her I'd felt sick, but was feeling better now. I helped her make dinner, watched television with her, and tried not to check the clock every 5 minutes. Rick had said he'd be late, but I knew that the moment he tried to call the car and realized it wasn't there, all hell was going to break loose. I'd printed out the Craigslist ad I'd posted for Dad's guitar, 1963 Martin D. 28 acoustic guitar, $50, which Miguel had somehow found and responded to, along with screenshots of similar guitars selling for $15,000 to $20,000 online. I had everything ready to show Rick exactly what he'd done to me, but I also knew that knowing wouldn't make him any less furious about his car. Rick's key turned in the front door at exactly 9:47 p.m., and I could hear him calling out, "Honey, I'm home," in that fake cheerful voice he used when he wanted to make a good impression. But within 30 seconds, I heard his footsteps running toward the garage, heard the automatic door grinding open, and then heard a sound I'd never heard from Rick before, a kind of strangled, choking gasp like someone had just punched him in the stomach. "Linda," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Linda, get out here right now." Mom and I rushed to the garage to find Rick standing in the empty space where his car should have been, his face white as paper and his hands shaking. "Someone stole my car," he whispered, like he couldn't quite believe the words coming out of his own mouth. "Someone stole Shelby. Oh, God, someone stole my car." He was already pulling out his phone to call the police when I cleared my throat and said the words I'd been practicing all afternoon. "Actually, Rick, I sold it. Got $50 for it." The silence that followed my words was deafening. Rick's face went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds: confusion, disbelief, rage, and then something that looked almost like terror as the implications of what I'd said started to sink in. "You what?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You sold my car?" "My car." Mom was looking back and forth between us like she'd walked into the middle of a foreign film without subtitles, completely lost as to what was happening. I pulled out my phone and showed Rick the screenshot of his own Craigslist ad, the one where he'd listed Dad's guitar for $50 with the description "old acoustic guitar, needs to go ASAP." His face went even whiter as he read his own words, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that I'd played him at his own game. "You remember this ad, don't you, Rick? The one where you sold my father's vintage Martin guitar for $50 while I was at work." "That's completely different," Rick exploded, his voice echoing off the garage walls. "That was just an old guitar. This is my car. My $32,000 car." I let him rant for a few more seconds before I calmly pulled out the printed pages I'd prepared, documentation showing that Dad's 1963 Martin D28 was actually worth between $15,000 and $20,000, depending on condition. "Actually, Rick, Dad's guitar was worth about half as much as your car. But you sold it for $50 anyway, so I figured that must be your standard pricing system." His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as he stared at the papers, probably doing the math in his head and realizing that he'd thrown away $15,000 of my inheritance for pocket change. Mom finally found her voice and asked what was going on, and I explained everything: how Rick had promised not to touch the guitar, how he'd sold it anyway while I was at work, how he'd lied about not remembering who bought it. With each word, I watched Mom's expression change from confusion to disappointment to something that looked almost like disgust. "You promised her you wouldn't touch that guitar," Mom said quietly, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard since Dad's funeral. "You looked me in the eye and promised that Sarah's father's guitar would be safe." Rick tried to backtrack, tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, but Mom held up her hand to stop him. "No, Rick. I heard you promise. We both heard you promise. And you broke that promise for $50. For the first time since Rick had moved into our house, I saw my mother really look at him, not with love or admiration or even tolerance, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who was finally seeing the truth. "Sarah," she said, turning to me with tears in her eyes, "I am so sorry. I should have protected your father's things better. I should have protected you better." That's when Rick made his biggest mistake of the night. He started yelling at Mom, telling her she was being ridiculous and emotional, and that she needed to get her daughter under control. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, called by Rick, who was screaming about theft and demanding that I be arrested immediately. Officer Martinez listened patiently as Rick ranted about his stolen car, nodding sympathetically until Rick finished his story. Then Officer Martinez turned to me and asked for my side of the story, and I calmly explained about the guitar, showed him the documentation of its value, and showed him Rick's own Craigslist ad. "So let me get this straight," Officer Martinez said, looking back and forth between us. "You sold her father's $15,000 guitar for $50, and now you're upset that she sold your car for the same amount?" Rick sputtered that it wasn't the same thing, that the guitar was just sitting there while his car was important, but Officer Martinez wasn't buying it. "Sir, from where I'm standing, it looks like you both committed the same crime. The question is whether you want to press charges against each other, because if you do, you're both going to jail tonight." That's when I played my final card. "Actually, Officer Martinez, I have the buyer's contact information, and I'm willing to help Rick get his car back. Miguel, that's the young man who bought it. He's a decent guy who just wanted to help his girlfriend get to nursing school. I think we can work something out." Rick's eyes lit up with hope, but I wasn't finished. Of course, I'd expect Rick to help me get my father's guitar back in return. Fair's fair, right? The hope died in Rick's eyes as he realized that he'd probably sold the guitar to someone who was long gone, and that even if he could find them, he'd have to pay fair market value to get it back, $15,000 instead of the $50,000 he'd pocketed. Officer Martinez looked at both of us and shook his head. "This is the most expensive family dispute I've ever been called to," he said. "But if you can work this out between yourselves, I'd prefer not to arrest anyone tonight." "Ma'am," he said to me, "can you really help him get his car back?" I nodded and pulled out my phone, calling Miguel's number while Rick watched with desperate eyes. Miguel answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation to him as honestly as I could. "I know this is crazy," I told him, "but I was trying to teach someone a lesson about taking things that don't belong to them. I can give you back the $50, plus another $100 for your trouble, if you're willing to return the car." Miguel was quiet for a long moment before he started laughing. "Lady, this is the wildest thing that's ever happened to me," he said. "But I get it. My grandmother always said that sometimes you have to give people a taste of their own medicine before they learn to behave. Yeah, I'll bring the car back, but I want to meet this guy who sold your dad's guitar. I want to look him in the eye and tell him what I think of men who steal from grieving daughters." Officer Martinez was grinning by the time I hung up the phone. "Well, this is definitely going in my report," he said. "Ma'am, you've got some serious backbone." "Sir," he said to Rick, "you might want to think twice before you mess with someone's family heirlooms again." Miguel showed up an hour later with his girlfriend Rosa, both of them looking like they'd just had the adventure of their lives. He handed Rick the keys to the Mustang and refused to take the extra $100 I offered him. "Keep your money," he said. "But you," he pointed at Rick, "you should be ashamed of yourself. My father died when I was 15, and if someone had sold his tools or his watch or anything that reminded me of him, I would have done a lot worse than take their car for a joyride." Rick mumbled something that might have been an apology, but Miguel wasn't finished. "That guitar you sold? It wasn't just wood and strings. It was her connection to her father, her heritage, her family history. You sold someone's soul for $50, man. Think about that." As Miguel and Rosa drove away in their beat-up Honda, I realized that I'd found more than just justice. I'd found allies, people who understood what Rick had done and why it was unforgivable. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Rick lasted exactly 3 more days in our house before Mom asked him to leave. She didn't yell or throw his things on the lawn or create any dramatic scenes. She just quietly told him that she couldn't be with someone who would lie to her and hurt her daughter like that. "I thought I needed someone to take care of me after James died," she told me that night as we watched Rick load his belongings into the Mustang. "But what I really needed was to remember that I'm strong enough to take care of myself." Rick moved in with his buddy Dave and started calling Mom constantly, begging for another chance, promising to find the guitar and buy it back. But Mom had made up her mind, And when Mom makes up her mind about something, it stays made up. She filed for divorce 2 weeks later, and Rick didn't even fight it. I think he knew that he'd lost more than just his marriage. He'd lost any claim to being a decent human being. I never did get Dad's guitar back, despite hiring a private investigator and posting rewards on every online forum I could find. Whoever bought it from Rick either didn't see my ads or didn't want to give it up, and I've made peace with that. But something unexpected happened about a month after Rick moved out. I got a call from Miguel, who told me that his uncle was a guitar maker and had been following my story online. "He wants to make you something special," Miguel said. "Not to replace your father's guitar, because nothing could do that, but to honor his memory and maybe give you a new way to connect with him." The guitar that Miguel's uncle crafted for me is beautiful, a custom acoustic made from aged wood with my father's initials inlaid in mother of pearl on the headstock. It doesn't sound exactly like Dad's Martin, but when I play it late at night, I can still feel him listening, still feel his presence in the music. The best part of this whole story isn't the revenge or the justice, or even getting rid of Rick. It's what I learned about myself and about the power of standing up for what matters. For years, I'd let Rick slowly erase my father from our home, thinking that keeping the peace was more important than protecting Dad's memory. But when he crossed that final line, when he took the one thing that was truly mine and sold it like garbage, I discovered that I had my father's backbone after all. Dad always taught me that some things are worth fighting for, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them that their actions have consequences. I hope that somewhere out there, someone is playing Dad's guitar and making beautiful music with it. And I hope that Rick thinks about what he did every time he sees that Mustang, every time he remembers how close he came to losing everything over $50 and a moment of casual cruelty. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's showing someone exactly who they really are and letting them live with that knowledge forever.